Hello, my name is Jason French, and today I'm going to go over how to be the first officer on scene at a crime scene and how to deal with it, what your responsibilities are, and a step-by-step way on how to be dealing with that sort of situation. So let's get started. So firstly, when you're pulling up to a crime scene, before you even get out of your car, step one, you want to actually call your dispatch and get all the available other police officers in the area to help you, as many as needed or as necessary for you to be able to properly take control of the scene. So that brings us to the second point, where once you get out of your patrol car and get on scene, you want to do a very quick survey, sort of to get an idea of how many officers exactly you're going to need, or if you're going to need additional help. This can include paramedics, fire, and things like that. So you're going to give dispatch another quick call if you need any other assistance that's going to help you sort of manage and stabilize the scene properly so you can get on and continue with your next steps on taking control of the scene. So our main job as a police officer is to preserve life. So if you arrive on scene and if there is anybody injured, it is your duty firstly to preserve life, to go and tend to that person and their needs. But also if there's not any people injured or in danger, you want to keep it that way. Preserve life in the fact that you need to prevent people from getting injured further or injured at all. So that is our main duty. So if somebody is injured, you should go and tend to them. After a few minutes, you should have some officers on scene to help you. So at this point, this is when you're going to start directing officers to set a perimeter and then to start controlling the scene. So this can be done by, for example, if there was a murder inside a house, you'd want to sort of set a perimeter outside the house. This could be using yellow crime scene tape. And then you're sort of going to be assigning officers as they come on scene to checkpoints. Our job after preserving life is preserving evidence so that we can do our job in finding and figuring out what happened. So in order to preserve evidence, we need to monitor the evidence. So what I mean by assigning officers roles is, as I took my example of having a murder inside of a house, if it was in a particular room, you would want to set officers on the outside of that perimeter that we just made. You'll want to have officers on the inside as well, but most importantly, you'll want them at, let's say, the front door of the house would be a big checkpoint to limit access on who's coming in and who's coming out, but also an officer standing guard at the door on where that room we talked about what had happened in. You want an officer standing there as well, just to help preserve evidence and to monitor who's coming in and out and making sure that people are doing their jobs properly and the evidence is being preserved. That is our main job at this point after we are done preserving life. So once all of this is being done, hopefully that the scene is secure enough where you can sort of give a little bit of time to the witnesses, hopefully, if there were any that were there. At this point, you just want to be very brief with them. You want to take names, addresses, and phone numbers that they can be contacted at because they will be interviewed later. And then we will tend to them a little bit later as we get some time as well. So hopefully once you are done with the witnesses that we, in the case of a murder, we have some other specialized units on the scene. This would include a forensics unit. This would include a crime scene investigation unit that specializes in this. If it has anything to do with guns, drugs, or gangs, you'd have guns and gangs on the scene as well. And so with all the other external parties that are on scene, you're going to be creating what is called a scene investigation plan with them. That's just sort of, you're going to go over what you guys are looking for, where you're going to be looking for it, what potential hazards can be in your way, if you need any additional equipment to execute any of those options that we just went over. So you guys are going to be very coordinated and very efficient at how you guys are going to be executing this scene investigation plan, and hopefully it'll go very smooth. And the idea is just to get everybody on the same page, like I said, so everything can go over very well, and then just work out any kinks that you guys would have or questions at the beginning, just for a smooth investigation. So as we just talked about, there hopefully will be witnesses at the scene. At this point, you can probably interview them, or if not, you'll be interviewing them at a later date. But just in case this happens, we're just going to go over a couple questions that you can ask them. With a witness interview, you're going to be wanting to ask a lot of open-ended questions. So the obvious ones would be who, what, where, when, why, and how. This sort of gives the witness an opportunity to give an undivided, sort of clear-cut, start-to-finish story without sort of you leading any questions, which is very important. You want to sort of get their perspective and untainted memory of what they saw and perceived as the story. Maybe you can get them to run it through from ending to beginning. It's sort of just another strategy to get them to maybe jog their memory and see if they forgot a part of their story. That is a very effective strategy to use at that point. But we're not interrogating this person. That is very important. We will not do an interrogation unless the witness's story is very inconsistent, you're catching a lot of lies, or if they're starting to tell facts that you think the person would know who committed the crime. So things like, oh, I think like this would have happened or something, then you'd want to maybe take it a step further and do an interrogation at that point. But that would be done, of course, later on as well by people who are more trained to do an interrogation. So dealing with a suspect that could be on scene, if you do run into a scene fairly quickly and there's a suspect on scene, it is very imperative that you get them in custody because, again, our job is to preserve life. So the suspect obviously has done a crime at this point and is a danger to other people in some way, shape, or form. So our job is to preserve life by preventing that from happening again. Secondly, we want to preserve evidence. Like I said before, that is another one of our jobs. So if the suspect has a gun in their hand or blood or anything, it is very important that we do not let them wash it off. This is going to be all taken by the forensics to run some tests through them to sort of maybe link them through the crime, just do their jobs properly. This goes with clothing and footwear as well. So if there was a gun, for example, like we said, there could be gunpowder. So they just want to be running their clothing and their footwear. So it's very important that we don't let them sort of, for whatever reason, take their clothing off or wash their clothing if that is a circumstance that could happen, because that is also something that we will be testing. Now, another very important one is this actually happened to 4 RCMP officers in Alberta. Very tragically, the suspect actually came back to the scene, I guess to sort of cover his own butt, and actually killed 4 RCMP officers that were on scene processing the scene on what just happened. So it is very imperative that if we know who the suspect is, that we don't let him or her back on the scene. This is very important because, again, we're preserving life. We don't want him coming back and hurting himself or others, but also preserving evidence as well, which is why we're there. We don't want him tampering with his own scene and sort of covering his own butt. So that is very, very important that the perimeter you just set, the officers know who this person is, if you guys do know, and not to let anybody on scene without letting you know and letting them come in, because you're the officer in charge. So you will need to keep track on who is coming in and who is coming out, and we'll go over how you're going to do that in just one second. So like I just mentioned, we are going to be going over sort of how to take notes, but also tracking who's coming in and out of the scene. So you're actually going to be taking a record of who's coming in, what time they're coming in at, and what they're doing. This is very important in case anything happens during the investigation, externally or internally, that we have a very clear log on who is coming in at what time and what they're doing, just to give us a very clear and concise version on why they're there, of course. In case anything happens, it's a very easy find. So that being said, we're just going to go over very quickly how you should be taking your notes. Just the basics to get it out of the way. You want to be taking your notes always in black or blue ink. This is so you don't go back and change it or erase something out. It's concrete and can't be finished without sort of being noticed. Whiteout is very noticeable. So if a mistake is made, let's say, you're just going to put a line across that word. and then you are just going to put your initials beside it and then correct it either beside it or make a reference at the next available space on the bottom, just to make sure that we know what you're talking about. So you're also going to want to be very consistent with your notes. So we're going to start out with that. So this is actually a notebook right here, as you can see. So on the first line, it actually says right here, Tuesday, October 10th, 2017, my shift right here. It's going to say the weather and then what section I'm at and then the address. So this is how I will always start all of my notebooks, as you can see. So date, weather, the section, and then the address. So this is very important, where you have a very consistent method of how you're writing your notes. This will make it a lot easier for you in the future, because your notes are actually just a reference for you to make if you're going to court for something. So if you are changing the way you write notes all the time, it's going to be very hard to stay consistent and knowing what you're actually writing. So by figuring out a consistent way to write your notes, it's going to be very easy for you later on to sort of know what you are doing. So let's go over a few basic things. As I just said, this is kind of a very brief thing on what you want to do, and this is an error example here that I kind of did on purpose. This was just an example. These were not events that actually happened in real life. So 100 Colonnade Road, I got the address wrong. So I just did a little cross out here, put the initials like I said, and then right beside it, I put 24 Colonnade Road, which was the real address. Also, if you have any blank lines or unfinished lines, you just want to be putting a line through it with your initials just right on the side there. That is perfectly okay. Or if you want to finish a page, just a big X or a line across it with your signature is perfectly okay. And that's what you're going to want to do. This is just a very brief example. Every time something changes or you go somewhere else, you're always going to want to put the times there, never across the margin, like I mentioned. And that's sort of just a brief example of how to take notes properly.